1904 portrait resurfaces and historians pale as they enlarge the image of the bride. The photograph arrived at the New Orleans Historical Collection in a water-stained cardboard box, part of an estate donation from a Garden District mansion being cleared after its elderly owner passed away. Archivist Claire Duchamp had seen hundreds of such donations over her 15-year career. Attics and basements yielding forgotten treasures and ordinary debris in equal measure. Most items need careful cataloging, but revealed little of historical importance. This particular box held typical remains of a wealthy family's past. Silk gloves yellowed with age, letters tied with faded ribbon, a tarnished silver compact with a cracked mirror, and at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, a single large photograph in an ornate brass frame with intricate floral detailing. Claire carefully removed the frame and looked at the image behind the clouded glass. It was a formal wedding portrait, the kind of detailed studio photograph common among New Orleans society families at the turn of the century. The photographer's stamped mark in the corner read Lavo & Son Portrait Studio, Royal Street, 1904. The portrait showed a bride and groom posed in the classic style of that time. The groom stood tall and stiff in a dark formal suit with a high collar, his expression serious and unsmiling, one hand resting on a decorated chair with a carved wooden back. Beside him sat the bride, her white dress a masterpiece of Edwardian fashion with layers of silk, detailed lacework, a high collar decorated with small pearls, and a fitted bodice that showed the craftsmanship of a skilled dressmaker. But what immediately caught Claire's attention was the bride's veil. It was unusually thick, made of heavy lace that created deep shadows across her face. Most bridal portraits from this period showed veils pulled back or pinned up to show the bride's features clearly. The photographs were meant to document beauty and social standing, but this veil hung forward, hiding much of the woman's face, creating an almost ghostly effect that made her look like a shadow rather than a living person. Claire moved the photograph to her desk and positioned her magnifying lamp over it. The image quality was remarkable for its age. The Lavo studio had been known for technical excellence and had used top-quality materials. She could see individual pearls on the bride's dress, the texture of the groom's mustache, the grain of the wooden chair, the pattern in the carpet beneath their feet. But the bride's face stayed shadowed and mysterious. Claire could make out the shape of her features, the curve of her jaw, the suggestion of a nose, but the expression was impossible to read through the heavy veil. Something about the pose felt wrong and uncomfortable. The bride's posture seemed too stiff, her shoulders pulled back tightly, her hands clasped together in her lap with a grip that suggested worry rather than joy. Every wedding photograph Claire had ever cataloged showed some sense of celebration, even those from arranged marriages in strict times. This one showed something else entirely. It showed fear. 2 days later, Claire sat beside Marcus Red in the collection's digital imaging lab. Marcus had worked with historical photographs for 12 years, specializing in restoration and enhancement of damaged or faded images. He treated each photograph as a puzzle, and pulling out information hidden by time, wear, or poor original exposure. "This one is in great shape physically," Marcus observed as the high-resolution scan appeared on his monitor. "The Lavo studio used top-quality materials. The print has survived remarkably well. But that veil is going to be difficult. It is creating significant shadow across the subject's face." Claire pulled her chair closer. "Can you work around it? I want to see her expression, her eyes. Something about this portrait feels wrong." Marcus's fingers moved across his keyboard, applying initial adjustments to the digital file. The image sharpened, contrast increased slightly. He zoomed into the bride's face, filling the screen with the veiled features. The heavy lace created a complex pattern of light and shadow, but modern software could analyze and adjust for such problems. "Let me try increasing shadow detail without overexposing the highlights," Marcus said, adjusting multiple settings at once. "This will take a few minutes to process properly." The software worked through its calculations, and gradually the bride's face became clearer. The shape of her nose appeared, the line of her lips, the contours of her cheeks beneath the veil. Marcus continued refining the enhancement, bringing up midtones, clarifying details that had been hidden for over a century. Then Claire saw it. "Marcus, stop right there." On the screen, now clearly visible, were streaks running down the bride's cheeks. Not shadows from the veil, not a flaw in the print, but actual moisture, tears caught in the moment the photograph was taken. The bride had been crying during her wedding portrait. That is unusual, Marcus said quietly. Emotional brides were not uncommon, but photographers typically waited for composure before exposing the plate. These studios charged significant fees. Clients expected perfect images. Can you enhance it further? Claire's voice was tight. I want to see everything. Marcus applied additional filters, and sharpening the focus even more. He adjusted the tonal curve, bringing out every possible detail in the shadowed areas beneath the veil. The bride's face filled the screen, and now they could see not just tears, but her expression. Eyes wide with fear, jaw tight with tension, every muscle in her face showing distress. And then Marcus noticed something else. He zoomed in further, focusing on the area around the bride's left eye, where the veil's shadow was deepest. He increased the exposure, compensating for the darkness. The discoloration became visible slowly, but once they saw it, there was no mistaking what it was. A bruise, dark and large, spreading from the bride's eye socket toward her temple. The heavy veil had not been a fashion choice or a stylistic decision. It had been a deliberate attempt to hide evidence of violence. Claire and Marcus sat in silence, staring at the screen. The crying bride, the concealing veil, the hidden bruise. This was not a wedding portrait. It was a imitation of something far darker. We need to identify these people, Claire said finally. I need to know who she was and what happened to her. The Lavo and Son Portrait Studio had been one of New Orleans' most respected photography businesses in the early 1900s, serving wealthy Creole and American families in the French Quarter and Garden District. The business had closed in 1932, but its records had been preserved by the Louisiana Photography Archive, kept in a climate-controlled facility near Tulane University. Claire contacted the archive's director, Dr. Simone Bertrand, explaining what she had found. Simone had spent her career preserving New Orleans' photographic heritage and immediately understood the importance of Claire's discovery. The Lavo sitting books are quite complete for that period, Simone said when Claire arrived at the archive the next afternoon. They were careful record keepers. Every client, every session, payment details, even notes about special requests or difficulties during sittings. They found the ledger for 1904 and began searching through entries from the spring and summer months. Wedding portraits were marked with a small decorative symbol in the margin, a tradition the Lavo studio had kept to separate these important commissions from ordinary sittings. On June 18, 1904, they found it. Wedding portrait, Miss Emily DeVoe and Mr. Robert Thornton. 4 plates exposed, special sitting arrangement, $15 paid in advance by DeVoe. The price was substantial, more than double the usual rate for wedding portraits, and the note about a special sitting arrangement was unusual. Claire had looked at hundreds of entries in the ledger, and very few included such remarks. DeVoe, Claire repeated the name. The DeVoe family was prominent in New Orleans society. I have seen the name in other collections. They owned sugar plantations up the river and had significant property holdings in the city. Simone was already pulling additional records. The Lavo studio kept a separate journal, more personal observations than the business ledger. The owner, Jean-Baptiste Lavo, was known for recording his thoughts about particularly memorable or difficult sessions. Let me see if there is an entry for this date. The journal was smaller, leather-bound, filled with Jean-Baptiste's flowing handwriting. Simone turned to June 1904 and found several entries. On June 19th, the day after the DeVoe Thornton sitting, Jean-Baptiste had, and at length, yesterday's wedding portrait troubles my conscience still. The DeVoe family arrived with the bride at exactly 10 o'clock as scheduled. Miss Emily was accompanied by her mother, Madame Celeste DeVoe, and the groom, Mr. Robert Thornton. Also present were Mr. Henry DeVoe, the bride's father, and Mr. Thornton's associate, whose name I did not catch, but whose presence seemed to make everyone uncomfortable. The bride herself appeared unwell, pale with reddened eyes, suggesting tears. When I asked whether we should postpone the sitting to allow her to compose herself, Madame DeVoe interrupted sharply, insisting we proceed immediately. The bride said nothing, simply stared at the floor. Most troubling was the veil. Madame DeVoe had brought it herself, an unusually heavy piece, far thicker than normal bridal veils. She insisted it be positioned forward, covering much of her daughter's face. When I suggested this would hide the bride's features, the very purpose of a wedding portrait, Madame Deveux became upset, stating the veil was essential and must remain as positioned. Jean-Baptiste's entry continued, and Claire felt her chest tighten as she read. I positioned the couple as requested. Mr. Thornton standing, the bride seated, the heavy veil arranged to cast maximum shadow. Through my lens, I could see the bride shaking, not the nervous excitement of a young woman on her wedding day, but fear, unmistakable, deep fear. Mr. Thornton kept his hand on her shoulder throughout the sitting, firmly, possessively. When I asked the bride to turn her head slightly to improve the composition, his grip visibly tightened, and she flinched. He smiled at me, a cold, practiced smile, and said his bride was simply overwhelmed by the importance of the occasion. I exposed 4 plates, though I knew even one would have been enough. I wanted the family gone. The atmosphere in my studio felt poisonous, wrong. As they prepared to leave, the bride looked at me, and directly for the first time. Even through that cursed veil, I could see her eyes, and what I saw there haunts me. She was pleading, silently, desperately pleading for help. But what could I do? The marriage contract was legal. The family's agreement was clear. A photographer does not interfere in the private affairs of wealthy clients. And yet, I find I cannot shake the feeling that I have taken part in something terrible. When Madame Deveux returned 3 days later to collect the finished portraits, she examined them carefully, nodded with satisfaction, and paid the rest of the money owed. She mentioned that her daughter and new son-in-law had already left for an extended honeymoon abroad. She did not say where. I pray I am wrong. I pray that young woman finds happiness in her marriage, but I fear she will not. Claire and Simone sat in silence after finishing the entry. Jean-Baptiste Lavo had witnessed something deeply wrong, had recorded it through his camera, and had been troubled by his inability to intervene. "We need to find out what happened to Emily Deveux after this photograph," Claire said. "Marriage records, society announcements, anything that tells us where she went and whether she survived." The Times-Picayune archives were digitized and searchable, making Claire's research much easier than it would have been even 10 years earlier. She started with June 1904, looking for the wedding announcement that would have come before the portrait sitting. She found it in the June 12th edition, 1 week before the photograph was taken. Marriage of interest to society. Miss Emily Celeste Deveux, daughter of Mr. Henry and Madame Celeste Deveux of Audubon Place to Mr. Robert Harrison Thornton of Boston, Massachusetts. The ceremony will be held at the Deveux family residence on June 17th, followed by a private reception for family and close friends. Mr. Thornton is associated with maritime shipping interests and has recently established business connections in New Orleans. The couple will reside abroad following the wedding. The announcement was brief, almost cold, unusual for a family as prominent as the Deveux. Most society weddings receive detailed coverage describing the bride's gown, the flowers, the guest list, the elaborate reception. This announcement read more like a duty than a celebration. Claire noted several details. Robert Thornton was from Boston, connected to maritime shipping interests, and had only recently made connections in New Orleans. The wedding was to be held at the family home, not in a church, suggesting either a wish for privacy or perhaps speed. And the couple would live abroad with no mention of where or for how long. She searched for any follow-up coverage, accounts of the actual wedding, descriptions of the ceremony, photographs of the bride in her gown. There was nothing. For a family of the Deveux' social standing, this silence was extraordinary. Then Claire searched for Robert Thornton, expanding her, include Boston newspapers. She found several mentions. Thornton had been involved in shipping ventures, had been investigated for questionable business practices involving cargo insurance fraud, but charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence. There were also brief mentions in Boston society columns, usually noting his presence at events where wealthy widows or unmarried women were present. A pattern appeared. Robert Thornton was a fortune hunter, a man who built relationships, and with wealthy families, particularly those with daughters of marriageable age. He had been engaged once before to a young woman in Philadelphia, but that engagement had been broken suddenly, under circumstances the newspapers politely declined to specify. Claire felt her stomach turn. The Deveux family had married their daughter to a man with a questionable past, a man suspected of fraud, a man whose previous engagement had ended mysteriously. She searched for information about the DeVoe family's financial situation in 1903 and 1904. It took hours of going through business records, bankruptcy filings, and property transactions, but eventually she found it. The DeVoe sugar plantations had been losing money for several years. A series of bad harvests combined with increased competition from Caribbean imports had seriously damaged the family's finances. In March 1904, Henry DeVoe had taken out a large loan to cover debts and maintain the family's lifestyle. The loan had come from a Boston financial firm, a firm in which Robert Thornton was listed as a partner. The picture became clear. Thornton had essentially bought Emily DeVoe. He had loaned her father money the family desperately needed, and in exchange, he had gained a beautiful young wife from an old New Orleans family. A wife who would give him social respectability and connections. And Emily, bound by family duty and social pressure, had had no choice but to accept. Then nothing. No further mentions in European papers. No record of their return to the United States. No travel documents showing movement between countries. It was as if they had simply vanished somewhere on the continent. Claire shifted her focus back to the DeVoe family. What she found was more disturbing than an absence of information. In February 1905, 8 months after the wedding, Madame Celeste DeVoe had been admitted to a private sanatorium outside New Orleans for treatment of a severe nervous disorder. The admission records, which Claire, and through the Louisiana Medical Archives, noted that Madame DeVoe was unable to be comforted regarding the fate of her daughter, showing symptoms of deep guilt and anxiety. The doctor's notes recorded Madame DeVoe's statements. She begged me not to make her marry him. She said he frightened her, that there was something cruel in his eyes. But we needed the money. Henry said we had no choice, and now she is gone, and I do not know if she is alive or dead. No letters come. He will not let her write to us. I know he will not. What have we done? What have we done to our child? Henry DeVoe had visited his wife once at the sanatorium in March 1905. The doctor's notes recorded the conversation. Patient's husband appeared defensive, insisted daughter was well and happy abroad, claimed letters had been sent but perhaps lost in international mail. When patient became upset, demanding proof of daughter's well-being, husband left abruptly. He did not return for later visits. Madame DeVoe in the sanatorium for 2 years. She was released in 1907, but her health never fully recovered. Claire found her death certificate dated November 1908. Cause of death listed as heart failure, but the doctor had added a note. Patient suffered from prolonged sadness related to an unresolved family tragedy. A mother who had traded her daughter for financial security and who had spent her final years consumed by guilt and fear. Claire's breakthrough came from a genealogy researcher in London named Elizabeth Parker, who specialized in Americans living in Edwardian Europe. Elizabeth had found a French death certificate from Nice dated January 1906 for an Emily Thornton, age 22, American, cause of death recorded as accidental fall from villa balcony. The certificate was filed by her husband, Robert Harrison Thornton. Emily had been dead for nearly 120 years, dying just 18 months after that terrible wedding photograph. But Elizabeth had kept searching and found something more disturbing. Thornton had returned to Boston in 1907, married again in 1909 to another wealthy young woman from New York, and that wife died in 1911 from an accidental fall down a staircase in their Manhattan home. 2 wives, both dead from falls, both within a few years of marriage. The pattern was unmistakable. Robert Thornton was not just a fortune hunter. Claire created an exhibition called Hidden in Plain Sight at the New Orleans Historical Collection. It centered on Emily's wedding portrait, alongside Jean-Baptiste Lavau's journal entry, and the enhanced images revealing the tears and bruise beneath the veil. It told the complete story of all 4 victims, their lives and dreams, the pattern of Thornton's crimes, and the systemic failures that allowed him to continue killing for 12 years. The exhibition included domestic violence resources, drawing connections between historical and modern issues. At the opening reception, an elderly woman stood motionless before Emily's portrait, with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Marie de Vaux-Lauron, Emily's great-great-aunt. She held a worn photograph of Emily as a young girl, perhaps 14, smiling with bright, hopeful eyes. Marie said the family had never spoken of Emily, only that she had married and died young abroad. She said Emily had begged not to be forced into the marriage because she knew something was wrong with Thornton, but her father would not listen. Claire added Marie's photograph to the exhibition, and the smiling girl beside the veiled bride, creating a devastating before and after. In the following weeks, more descendants came forward. A great-granddaughter of Grace Worthington brought several of Grace's watercolors that had survived in an attic. A descendant of Catherine Price discovered a trunk containing her unpublished manuscripts, poetry and essays that revealed a sharp mind and deep feeling for those struggling with poverty. Helen Bradford's great-nephew donated letters Helen had written expressing her fears about Thornton. Each edition enriched the exhibition, building a fuller picture of who these women had been and what had been taken from them. The exhibition became national news. Scholars wrote papers analyzing the connection between gender, class, and violence in early 20th century America. Domestic violence organizations used it as a teaching tool. But for Claire, the most meaningful result was simple. She had given voice to 4 women whose stories had been silenced. Emily had left evidence of her terror hidden in plain sight, trusting that someday someone would understand. That heavy veil meant to conceal her tears and bruises had failed. Modern technology had cut through the shadows, revealing the truth Jean-Baptiste Lavaux had sensed but could not quite see. More than a century later, Emily de Vaux and the 3 women who shared her fate were finally being remembered not as nameless victims or shameful family secrets, but as individuals who mattered, whose talents had been real, and whose courage in the face of impossible circumstances deserved recognition. The wedding portrait remained on permanent display at the New Orleans Historical Collection. Emily's tears and bruise no longer hidden, transformed from a moment of terror into justice, remembrance, and warning.